Good morning and welcome to Letter to Philippi Live. Sorry for a late start. I had a meeting that I was in this morning and we're getting a little later start, but we will be looking at Philippians chapter 4 today and the final chapter of Paul's letter to Philippi. And we will be looking at chapters 4, verses 1 through 3, the closing words of the chapter. Paul gives his beginning, his closing of this letter, and then he'll be discussing the issue of disunity in the Messianic community, disunity between two of the leaders in the community, Disunity and Syntyche, and how the disunity between the leaders can and will affect the whole Messianic community in Philippi. So Paul is dealing here, and as I said, for those who see this letter as being one of multiple letters edited together, they see this section here in verses 2 and 3, the issue of Disunity and Syntyche, the two women leaders in the congregation who were in dispute, as one of the letters written to deal with this issue of disunity between these leaders and how their disunity reflects on the whole community and how the whole community is in a place of distress because of these two leaders, these two prominent people in the community who are in disunion from one another. And as we said, the theme of humility runs throughout the whole book of Philippians. So we can see here that it could be an issue of pride, the opposite of humility. There was lack of humility in one of these or both of these individuals that caused the disunity between them. So Philippians chapter 4 is the final chapter of the letter, in which Paul addresses the letter's underlying purpose, the issue of division among two leaders in the community. Disunity and Syntyche are their names. Throughout the letter, Paul stresses that disunity is grounded in a lack of humility. Here Paul calls these two leaders to return to unity grounded in their modeling of Yeshua's example. This chapter also includes familiar verses on joyful living as a follower of Yeshua, in verse 6, we will look at in our next time together, focusing on good things, rejecting evil thoughts, verse 8, and later in the week we'll look at a divine empowerment for works of service to God, in verse 13. But Paul concludes this letter with gratitude to the Philippians for their faithful financial and physical support of his ministry, which we'll see in verses 14 through 18, and with words of encouragement and blessing. Indeed, Paul loved the community of Philippi and encouraged him, and also the inception of his work, he saw them as they were the first European congregation, the first congregation of Yeshua believers on the European continent that he reached out to and brought the message of the Messiah. Paul sees them as really the beginning of his work of reaching the uttermost parts of the earth, the ends of the earth that Yeshua spoke about in Acts chapter 1, verse 8. So again, for those who are just joining us now, this is the Letter to Philippi live broadcast, a daily teaching program where we look at Paul's letter to Philippi from a Messianic and Jewish theological perspective. We look at this letter that Paul wrote to the people of Philippi and see how it was understood in its context, and also how we can apply these teachings to our lives, how we can, as Paul calls it, to be more and more and more in the Messiah. So first we come to verse 1 of chapter 4, which basically begins the closing words of his chapter. As this is the final chapter of the letter, Paul will now go into sharing these words with the people of Philippi. Okay, can you hear me now? So, I guess... So can you... Okay. So... So now... So... I'm not sure if I'm... So we have the sorry for the delay there. We're having trouble with our microphone feed, and we will try to continue from there. So in these closing words in of the chapter of this letter, Paul in verse 1 of chapter 4 says, "So my brothers, who I love and long for, my joy and my crown, my dear friends, keep standing firm in union with the Lord." As the victor in athletic competition would receive a prize, usually an olive branch, wreath, or crown, Paul considers his relationship and ministry to the Philippians to be his prize for faithful service and a great source of joy in his final days of his life. Paul shares the Philippians are a great joy to him, and despite his suffering and impending execution, he can rejoice that their faith in Yeshua and their growing more like the Messiah is a spiritual reward, a crown for their and his faithfulness to God. So now we get into the issue of the disunity of the community in verses 2 and 3. In verse 2 we read, "I beg Euodia and I beg Syntyche to agree with each other in union with the Lord." As Paul concludes this letter, he mentions the possible primary reason for the letter, confronting the disunity in the community because of the disagreement between Euodia and Syntyche, which were two women in leadership among the Yeshua believers in Philippi. Paul knew conflicts among leaders would be detrimental to the community, and therefore he took the opportunity in his letter to confront divisions between two prominent women in Philippi. Paul's use of parakaleo, meaning beg, urge, exhort, appeal to, shows the importance of this issue to him and the negative effect on the whole community with these two leaders being in disunity. That Paul is actually begging these women to come back together in unity for the sake of the community in Philippi, and for them to come together, put aside whatever issues are keeping them apart, for the sake of the betterment and for the health of the whole Messianic community in Philippi. Throughout the letter, Paul has been dealing with the importance of humility, with positive examples of humility, Yeshua the Messiah being the greatest example, which we see in the Messianic hymn in chapter 2. And we also see the examples of Timothy and Epaphroditus, two flesh and blood people that they knew in Philippi, that were held out as examples of those who are truly modeling humility. And then we see in chapter 3 a negative example of humility, the pride of the false teachers who were threatening the Philippian community with their false teachings. And now we see here in chapter 4 another issue which could be related to pride, is this disunity between Euodia and Syntyche. This disunity between these two leaders in the community that Paul is confronting here, and even begging them and appealing to them, exhorting them to come together, put aside whatever is keeping them apart, and live together in the community for the betterment of themselves and for the betterment of the Messianic community in Philippi. Paul's emphasis early in the letters on humility leading to unity, and Paul sheds light on the issue of pride and lack of humility in the relationship of Euodia and Syntyche, which not only affected them, was an issue of concern for the whole Philippian Messianic community. So we don't know the specific issue that kept these women in disunity. But as this theme of the book is focused on humility and self-sacrifice of the Messiah Yeshua, it would make sense that there was some issue of lack of humility, lack of self-sacrifice, putting themselves before others. That could be the issue that kept these two leaders of Euodia and Syntyche in disunion, and therefore, as leaders in the community itself in disunion. Especially as people could take sides, whether I'm on Euodia's side or I'm on Syntyche's side, that their disunity would spread throughout the whole Messianic community in Philippi. Paul twice used the word phroneo, which means referring specifically to the attitude of the people to one another. Paul first used phroneo to describe Yeshua's humble mindset in Philippians 2:5. Paul then used it in imploring Euodia and Syntyche to unity for the sake of community. Paul is reminding his women that their mindset should be that of Messiah, and calling them to put aside their wrong attitude in order to model Yeshua, who is their ultimate example. So Paul here is using this word, the Greek word phroneo, that the attitude of people to one another, as in Philippians 2:5, he says, have this mind with you of Messiah Yeshua, who laid aside his place in the heavenlies, his place as the divine Messiah in the heavenlies, to come into our world as a baby, to have that mindset of self-sacrifice, have that mind of humility. And he uses the same Greek word here, speaking to Euodia and Syntyche, that they too have the mind of Messiah, have the mind of humility, have the mind of self-sacrifice of the Messiah. And if they do that, then whatever issue is separating them would be laid aside, and they would come to unity together and unify the community as these two people in a prominent position of leadership live as examples to all those in the people in Philippi. And Paul is calling them for their sake, for their spiritual lives, and also for the spiritual lives of the Messianic community in Philippi, for them to come together in unity and to model the Messiah. And by modeling humility, by modeling the self-sacrifice of the Messiah, they will come together, and also the Messianic community in Philippi would come together. Unity in Philippi and within any Messianic community required the people to follow the example of Yeshua and model his self-sacrificing humility. Such behavior was particularly important for the leaders, such as Euodia and Syntyche, who were in a position of influence in their community. As Paul modeled Messiah, he expected those in leadership to do the same. That everyone in the Messianic community should model themselves after the Messiah, should seek to model the humility, the self-sacrifice of Yeshua, and especially those who are in leadership positions, as an example to the community, as ones who lead by example. Paul calls Euodia and Syntyche, and all those who are given responsibility of leadership in the Messianic community, to understand that they need to model the Messiah for their sake and also for the sake of the Messianic community. That our Messianic synagogues will be more like the Messiah, as the leaders and the people in the congregation have the example of the Messiah and live the example of the Messiah, live the self-sacrifice of Yeshua each day in their lives. In verse 3, we read, I request you, loyal Syzygus, to help these women, for they have worked hard proclaiming the good news with me, along with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. Paul here appeals to Syzygus, which means is a proper name in Dr. David Stern's translation of the Complete Jewish Bible, to help bring unity to the Philippian community by assisting Yodi and Syntyche to resolve the issue that divides them. Interesting, some translations do not use Syzygus as a proper name. For example, the English Standard Version uses the word companion, which is the English translation of the Greek word Syzygus, for the person Paul calls to counsel the two women. So in the Complete Jewish Bible, the Jewish New Testament, Dr. David Stern took this word Syzygus and used it as a proper name for this person that Paul is appealing to them to come aside Yodi and Syntyche, to bring them together, of which many other congregations, not congregations, but translations of the Brit Hadashah will just use the word companion, co-worker, rather than having it as a proper name, but actually just translating the word Syzygus, which means companion, into English. But here we see this Dr. Stern actually made this as a proper name of Syzygus, as being a person in the Philippian community, another leader who could come beside and bring these women together. Paul referred to Yodi and Syntyche as his fellow workers, or workers with a close working relationship with Paul in ministry. Like Paul, they would have faced persecution with a commitment to the work of spreading the good news of Messiah. As leaders in the Messianic community, their lack of unity affects the whole community. Throughout his letter, Paul calls the Philippians to unity through modeling the humility of Yeshua. As he closes the letter, he calls for unity and humility to begin among the leaders of the community, especially between Yodi and Syntyche, as they, like Paul, serve examples of Messiah for the people. In addressing the conflict between these two women leaders, Paul stresses the importance of accountability for all in the Messianic community, from the leaders to everyone sitting in the congregation. Paul's emphasis on the importance of leaders serving examples of Messiah is a theme throughout the letter. Just as Paul uses himself, Timothy, Epaphroditus, and Clement as examples, he also wants Yodi and Syntyche to resolve their disunity so they can be examples of Messiah to those people over which they have influence. In his opening words of the letter in chapter 1, verse 1, Paul addresses the congregational leaders and shamashim, the elders and deacons, clarifying that Philippi had an established leadership structure and making sure the Philippian Messianic community leaders were listening to his message. As the leaders of the community model the Messiah, their examples should draw the people to follow the example of Yeshua. Paul places great importance on the unity and Messiah-like modeling of leaders. And that's why he focused so much here as he concludes this letter to people of Philippi, wanting to speak to the issue of the disunity between Yodi and Syntyche, and calling Syzygus as another leader in the community to come besides these women to encourage them to unity amongst themselves, to model the self-sacrifice, model the humility of Yeshua, and set aside that which is dividing them and would and could divide the whole Messianic community in Philippi, especially as if whatever issue is holding them apart, people were to just take sides. Some people, that I'm on Yodia's side or I'm on Syntyche's side. But for there to be unity in the community, there needs to be, first and foremost, unity among those who are in leadership, that those who have been called to lead in the Messianic community, that they need to model the Messiah, that the people see Yeshua through them. And Paul is, as he said, he used the word that he's begging them, imploring them that they come together, whatever is in between them, whatever is their issue of division, Paul calls them to deal with it, and he also calls Syzygus to come alongside them to resolve this issue of division between them and within the Messianic community in Philippi. Paul places great importance on the unity and Messiah-like modeling of leaders, and he makes clear his intent to bring Euodia and Syntyche back together as one in Messiah for their own sake as well as the betterment of the community. Since the Philippians highly valued their Roman citizenship and the prominence of Philippi as a Roman colony, Paul declares that through their faith in Yeshua, they've even greater citizenship as one written in the book of life, a citizenship in heaven. As we talked about in chapter 3, verse 20, where Paul says, you are citizens of heaven, that as they valued so much their Roman citizenship, their citizenship in Philippi, which had great value in their world and in their lives of today, Paul reminds them that they have a greater citizenship, a citizenship in heaven that is far beyond anything in this world, and they have it because of their faith trust in Yeshua. And Paul here is again reminding these leaders, Euodia and Syntyche, who are in disagreement, that their names are written in the book of life. They are citizens of heaven, and now he calls them to understand they need to model that citizenship, model what it means to be a citizen of heaven by coming together, putting aside whatever issues are between them, and to come together for their own sake, for their own life following the Messiah, but also for the greater Messianic community in Philippi, so that people see from their example of modeling Yeshua, there's people who see the humility of the Messiah in them, see the self-sacrifice of the Messiah in them, that they too would model that. So Paul is so concerned here that the dispute between these women is threatening the whole of the Messianic community in Philippi, and Paul calls them to come together. He pleads with them to come together and reminding them of their heavenly citizenship, that their names are written in the book of life. They are ones who are co-workers with him in the work of the Messiah. And now their division is not demonstrating that heavenly citizenship, not demonstrating their previous work and service to God alongside Paul. So Paul is basically calling them to return to the service that they have been called to, that where they had been serving their place of leadership in the community, and to be examples of the Messiah to the people in Philippi, that they had been positive examples to the people of Philippi. They had been fruitful in their work of making the Messiah known in Philippi, but now they're in disunity, and that disunity is reflecting on the whole community of Philippi. So Paul calls them to come together, and even calls other ones like Syzygus to come beside them, to basically reacquaint them with their heavenly citizenship, that their name is written in the book of life, and they now need to live out what that means in this world, that they have the atonement of Yeshua in their life. They have been brought to new life in Yeshua, and now they need to live out and to live their lives like the Messiah. As we said, that Paul uses the same wording that he used in Philippians 2:5, speaking about the humility of the Messiah, that have this mind in you, which is also in the Messiah. And then we see the example of Yeshua through the Messianic hymn. He using the same Greek word there, phroneo, to call the people in Philippi to also have the mind of the Messiah. And in their disunity, they're not living in the mind of the Messiah. They're not living by the the example of the Messiah. So Paul is calling them to return to that, to return to the mind of the Messiah that they left behind in their disunity and in the disunity among them and within the Messianic community in Philippi. We can see this. We can see that this look at the book of life in the end of days in the words of Isaiah, where he says, "Those left in Zion and remaining in Jerusalem will be called holy, and everyone in Jerusalem written down for life." And that's Isaiah 4:3. The book of life is a Jewish concept that plays a prominent role in the final judgment described in the book of Revelation, and also in the High Holy Day liturgy of Rosh Hashanah. So Paul here is speaking to these women, these women in leadership in Philippi, and wanting them to understand that they are not at this time modeling the Messiah. Their disunity shows that they are not modeling the humility and showing the negative example of humility, pride, and not showing the self-sacrifice. That their disunity means that they're putting their desires ahead of the community, of the example of the Messiah. So for the sake of them, for the sake of the community in Philippi, Paul is calling Euodia and Syntyche to remember who they are. They are citizens of heaven. They are co-workers with Paul in making Messiah known in Philippi. And they need to return to that. They need to lay aside whatever is holding them back from being in full union with one another and in full union with the Messianic community. And in their role as leaders, as examples to the people of Philippi, about the import of modeling the Messiah, that they, as leaders, were to model the Messiah, and the people were to see from their example and model the Messiah as they modeled the Messiah, as Paul talks about his own modeling of the Messiah, which was reflected in Timothy and Epaphroditus and Syzygus here he mentions. He wants them to know that they need to come together, that unity of the Messianic community in Philippi is dependent on the people, especially the leaders, to be in unity together so that the whole community can move forward in modeling Messiah. So this concludes our time today looking at Philippians. We looked at Philippians chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, as Paul begins the conclusion of this letter. This is the fourth chapter of the 4 chapters in the book. And we looked at verse 1, where he begins with words in conclusion. And then in verses 2 and 3, we look at the issue of disunity between Euodia and Syntyche. And Paul's begging them to come together for their own spiritual life, but also for the wholeness, for the unity of the Messianic community in Philippi. And for us today to understand that for our congregations to be unified, there needs to be unity between all in the community, especially among those who are in leadership positions, that the leaders, as examples to the community, as ones that the people are to model, that they need to be in unity in both their vision and just in their personal interaction with one another, that the people can see the unity among those in leadership and model that in their lives, that the whole community can model the Messiah. And that starts with those who are in leadership. So Paul shares here how important it is for there to be unity among all in the community, especially the leaders. And this is what he was sharing with here. As I said, this is one of the major issues that Paul is dealing with in the letter, is this issue of disunity. So Paul here has spoken to about this issue in the community. He's called these women, Euodia and Syntyche, to return to union with one another for the sake of the unity of the community. And our next time together, tomorrow, we'll be looking at verses 4 through 6 of chapter 4, living in union with the Messiah. So Paul, after dealing with this issue of disunity, is going to speak about living in union with the Messiah, that he dealt with this issue of disunity, and now he's saying, now that we have this issue dealt with, now that I've confronted this issue, I want to speak to you about what it's like to live in union with Messiah. So we'll be looking at that tomorrow as Paul looks at in chapters 4, verses 4 through 6, on living in union with Messiah. We'll be looking at what it means to be in unity with the Messiah and rejoicing in our connection with Yeshua, our righteous Messiah. So that will conclude our time today, and this is Letter to Philippi Live, and we coming to you Monday through Friday from 12 p.m. Pacific Time, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 10 p.m. Jerusalem Time, and we will continue going through the book of Philippians here in our daily study. And if you want more information on Letter to Philippi, my newly found Messianic Jewish Theological and Teaching Organization, just go to lettertophilippi.org. There you can ask any questions you have for us. You can leave a prayer request. I want to be praying for you. We'll be talking about the importance of prayer in our next time together as Paul speaks to the people of Philippians about the centrality of bringing everything to God in prayer. If you'd like to purchase a copy of my commentary on Philippians, you can go to our resources page. If you want to make a contribution to the work of Letter to Philippi, we'd greatly appreciate that. You can make a one-time contribution or an ongoing monthly contribution. We truly appreciate that to keep this work going. And any other things you want to learn about our work, we have on our website. Just go to lettertophilippi.org, and we will see you back tomorrow. Thank you for watching. Appreciate everyone who took the time to listen today. Hopefully, you will take what Paul said here in your lives and seek to bring unity in your own lives, a unity with those around you, and unity in your Messianic community by following the example of the humility and self-sacrifice of Yeshua, our righteous Messiah. So thank you for watching. Have a great day. Shalom for now, and we'll see you at noon tomorrow and for our next time together as we look at living in union with the Messiah, verses 4 through 6 of chapter 4. So shalom, and have a great day. Thank you. Letter to Philippi Live comes to you as an initiative of lettertophilippi.org. Shalom.